when was Jesus crucified? Was he crucified on Wednesday? Was he crucified on Friday? Was it in AD 31 or 32 or 33 or, what year, and all of that kind of thing. We know that Jesus was crucified on Passover, which is the 14th day of the first month in the Jewish year, which is the month of Abib or Nisan, depending on which name you use. But there are some significant difficulties in determining when this actually happened. The Jewish calendar is, okay, here's my questions. Was it Wednesday or Friday, and what years? The Jewish calendar is based on both lunar and solar cycles. In other words, the cycle of the moon, which is months, and the cycle of the earth going around the sun, which gives us the year. And the Jews typically took the first sliver of the moon that they could see after the new moon, and then they determined that when they could see that first little sliver in the evening, because that's when you see it, is in the evening in the West. And when they could see that first little sliver, then they would say, okay, this begins the first day of our month. And their new year would begin around spring equinox, after which, the first new moon after spring equinox. Okay, so here's a calendar that we have from the year 31 AD, and we see that spring equinox is approximately March 21st. That's usually, it's around there, 20th, 21st, maybe 22nd. That's the way it is now. Well, the first new moon after spring equinox in that year would have been April 10th. You can see it there. And usually, new moon is when the moon is directly in line between the earth and the sun, and we don't see it at all. It's totally invisible. That's called conjunction. Okay, and on any calendar that shows the phases of the moon, new moon will be the day when the moon is totally invisible. Well, possibly the next evening, the Jews may have seen that first visible crescent, and so that would have been April 11th. And so then they would have declared April 12th as the first day of the month. Well, then when you go from there, you count 14 days. Okay, there's the first day of the month. You count 14 days, you get to April 25th, which is a Wednesday. Well, was Jesus crucified on that Wednesday? There's a lot of discussion on that between different groups. But if he was crucified on Wednesday, that causes problems, because Ellen White tells us that he was crucified on Friday. Well, this is the year 31. Well, how does this work? If it doesn't work in the year 31, then is it a different year? Well, we got to answer all these questions. Here's one of the problems that we have. If he wasn't crucified in 31 AD, then our interpretation of prophecies like Daniel 8 and Daniel 9, that gets thrown off. So where are we with this whole thing? Well, here's some quotes that Ellen White explains some things from the Spirit of Prophecy, Volume 3, page 205. This is talking about the disciples after Jesus was crucified, and actually even after he was resurrected. It says they were terribly depressed. That is, the disciples were terribly depressed by the events that had crowded upon them. On the sixth day, which would be Friday, they had seen their master die. Upon the first day of the succeeding week, the next Sunday, they found themselves deprived of his body, and the stigma resting upon them of having stolen it away for the purpose of practicing a deception upon the people. So, they were still trying to figure out what was going on. They despaired of ever correcting the false impressions that had gained ground against them, and now they were newly perplexed by the reports of the believing women. In their trouble, their hearts yearned for their beloved master, who had always been ready to explain the mysteries that perplexed them and to smooth their difficulties. So this quote is saying he died on Friday. This next quote talks about the year 31. From the Desire of Ages, page 233. Then said the angel, he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, which would be 7 years. For 7 years after the Savior entered on his ministry, the gospel was to be preached especially to the Jews. For 3.5 years by Christ himself, and afterward by the apostles. In the midst of the week, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. Daniel 9:27. In the spring of AD31, Christ, the true sacrifice, was offered on Calvary. Then the veil of the temple was rent in twain, showing that the sacredness and significance of the sacrificial service had departed. The time had come for the earthly sacrifice and oblation to cease. So she's telling us he definitely died on Friday, and he definitely died in AD31. So how do we reconcile these things? Where do we go with this? The calendar that we have nowadays, and pretty much the whole world uses, is the Gregorian calendar. It was introduced by Pope Gregory XIII in October of 1582 to correct a problem that was kind of, in that time, they were having some difficulties with calculating some things, and the Pope wanted a convenient and accurate way to determine the date of Easter ahead of time. You can't just wait until a couple days before Easter and say, okay, now we're going to have Easter on such and such a Sunday. They had to be able to predict it and schedule it ahead of time. And they wanted to be able to sort of coordinate it with the time of Passover. It could never be on the same day as Passover because that wouldn't look right, but they wanted to have it around the time of Passover. So the Pope, he discussed it with various scientists and astronomers and whatever, and they came up with this new plan for the new calendar, and it introduced leap years at certain times to coordinate the season, the spring season, and keep the months synchronized so that things would work out right, and so that they would have the celebration of Easter at the proper time according to the actual seasons of the year. And it turned out that the Gregorian calendar is quite accurate in that way. Well, there's something that kind of is the main factor in why this is a problem, and it's called the precession of the equinoxes. And this is the reason why the Gregorian calendar had to be brought in, was to deal with a problem with what's called the precession of the equinoxes. And here we have a definition from the dictionary of what that means. The slow westward shift of the equinoxes along the plane of the ecliptic, resulting from precession of the Earth's axis of rotation and causing the equinoxes to occur earlier each year. So if our leap years in our calendar didn't make the correction, the spring equinox, which is, to us, we say it's the first day of spring in March, if the Gregorian calendar didn't make the proper adjustments there, that day of the first day of spring would slowly move through the calendar and get closer and closer to February, and then closer and closer to January. And so, things would really get messed up. Well, we'll try to understand a little bit about what's going on here. Some of these words that are in here are, they're big words, and you got to be a scientist to understand them. But here is an illustration of what is happening with our Earth. Our Earth is spinning all the time like a top or a gyroscope, and it's very slowly wobbling like you see in this picture here. And the wobble takes about 26,000 years to make a full circle. Well, what that causes is, for one thing, the axis right now is pointing toward the North Star. And so when we find the North Star, we know that's north. Well, that hasn't always been the case. And it won't be in, a few hundred years or whatever. Of course, the Earth isn't going to last that long, and God will make a correction on things. But the axis points to different parts in the sky. Through the years, that changes. Okay, that's called the precession of the equinoxes. As the wobble goes around this circle, it changes when the equinox happens. And this was discovered way back, even before the time of Jesus, by a Greek mathematician named Hipparchus. He compared some of his calculations with other calculations that had been made before that, and he said, there's something going on here. This is changing. And so he's the one that actually discovered that. Well, the precession of the equinoxes has an effect on our seasons and on our calendar. And here is a website where the question is asked, do solstices and equinoxes shift over time? Okay, the solstice is when for us here in the Northern Hemisphere, the summer solstice is when the sun is the highest in the sky. That gives us the longest daytime of the year. And the winter solstice is in December, and that is the shortest day of the year. Of course, in the Southern Hemisphere, it's just the opposite. But those are the solstice is the longest and shortest day of the year. The equinox is when day and night are equal. And so the question is asked here, do solstices and equinoxes shift over time? And here's part of the answer. There was more to the answer, but I just only picked out this part. A sidereal calendar, and sidereal has to do with where we are in relation to the sun and the stars. Okay, it has to do more with the stars than it does with the sun. Okay, so a sidereal calendar would explain why you might think that precession would cause the dates of equinoxes and solstices to change in the calendar year. That would result in a shift in the calendar of 1 full month in 1/12 of the cycle length of the precession of the equinoxes. Okay, remember the cycle of the precession of the equinoxes is about 26,000 years. And so it's saying that the equinoxes would shift about 1 month in 1/12 of that cycle, and then it finishes there, or about 1 full month about every 2,000 years. Well, when I read that, I thought, okay, 2,000 years. 2,000 years ago was the time of Jesus. So this is saying that the equinox would shift about 1 full month since the time of Jesus. Okay. Here's a quote from Josephus, the Jewish historian, where he makes a comment about this, about the time of Passover. This is his what he wrote about Passover. In the month of Xanthicus, which is by us called Nisan, and is the beginning of our year, on the 14th day of the lunar month, when the sun is in Aries, Aries is a constellation in the sky, and that has to do with the 12 constellations of the year and all that stuff. That's a completely different subject. For in this month it was that we were delivered from bondage under the Egyptians. Okay, when the sun was in Aries was the month they were delivered. The law ordained that we should every year slay that sacrifice which I before told you we slew when we came out of Egypt, which was called the Passover. So he's saying the Passover occurs when the sun is in Aries. Okay, now we have another quote here from another website talking about the precession of the equinoxes again. Precession is a slow wobble of the Earth's spin axis over a cycle of 25,800 years. The ecliptic stays where it is, but the equator, the plane in which Earth spins, steadily changes the direction of its tilt. Therefore, the vernal equinox point, that is the spring equinox, that's vernal equinox, which is the point when the equator crosses the ecliptic. And if you want to learn all this stuff, you're going to have to go somewhere else to some astronomy website or something to understand all these terms. But the point where the equator crosses the ecliptic keeps shifting westward along the ecliptic. 2 millennia ago, in other words, 2,000 years ago, it was at the beginning or the western edge of Aries. But by now, it has slid back into the middle of Pisces. That's a different constellation. And it has shifted the spring equinox a month forward, which means that 2,000 years ago, the spring equinox came a month later. Okay, process that a little bit. That means that the first month in the time of Jesus began in May rather than in April. Now, here's another interesting thing, and this is a historical thing that kind of comes into the picture. there are some historical writings from the ancient Chinese that seem to indicate that the Chinese were aware of Jesus' crucifixion. Now here we have Emperor Guangwu, who reigned from 25 AD to 47 AD. This is in the Chinese Empire, or the Chinese, whatever they called it there. And he wrote this in the 4th month of the year on the day of Renwu. This is what he wrote. Yin Yang have mistakenly switched, and the sun and moon were eclipsed. Now, an eclipse is when they get dark. So the sun and the moon went dark. The sins of all the people are now on one man. Pardon is proclaimed to all under heaven. Okay, this was written during the time that he was the emperor in the year 31 AD, according to their historical records. Here's another quote from ancient Chinese writings, and I have the website above there. Eclipse on the day of Gui Hai, man from heaven died. So somehow something happened in China that indicated to them that the man from heaven had died, that the sins of all mankind were on one man, and all this kind of stuff. Okay, so this was, I'm going to back up here. This was in the 4th month of the Chinese year. Now, they figured their year is a little different than we do, but this was in the 4th month of their year. So now we'll go forward. According to the Wikipedia, the Chinese New Year starts with the new moon that happens between January 21 and February 20. Okay, that's different than when we start our new year now and when the Jews started their new year. But this is when the Chinese would start their new year was with the new moon that happened between these two dates that you see the arrows pointing to. Okay, in that year, 31 AD, the new moon happened on February 10th. So that was the first day of the Chinese New Year. Okay, first day of the first month in China. So if that was the first day of the first month, then the first day of the 4th month would have been the 10th of May. That would have been the new moon in May. Okay. Now here we have the Bible verse that talks about the darkness. Matthew 27:45. Now from the 6th hour there was darkness over all the land unto the 9th hour. That indicates that there was 3 hours of darkness, and it was over all the land. It was a widespread thing. Well, that could mean over all the world. So even the Chinese would see this 3 hours of darkness, which would be a major event for them. Okay? That's not the usual thing. And it wasn't an eclipse. Here's a little illustration of a solar eclipse, which is when the moon gets between the earth and the sun and creates a shadow on the earth. And we had an eclipse last year that came across the United States, and it was a big deal. But a solar eclipse can only last just a few minutes, 3, 4, 5 minutes, something like that. And then you see the sun again. So this 3 hours of darkness could not have been a solar eclipse. For one thing, the darkness at the time Jesus died was not at the new moon time when a solar eclipse could happen. It was at the full moon time, which is when there can be a lunar eclipse, when the moon gets into the shadow of the earth. But even a lunar eclipse can only last about an hour, and it's not totally dark because we have what's called the blood moon effect, because the Earth's atmosphere reflects some of the light from the sun, and so it keeps the moon lighted up a little bit. And so this darkness that happened at the time that Jesus died was not a normal eclipse because it went on for 3 hours. That's totally supernatural. Okay, going back to the calendar again. If the equinox in the year 31 was a month later than it is now, then it would have been in April. Okay, April 21 or somewhere around there. And the new moon after that would have been the 10th of May. And the Jews would have declared the first day of their month as May 12th. So that would have been the first day of the first month. And 14 days later would have been the 25th of May, which is a Friday. So if this is all correct, and I can't say absolutely, but it does give a solution to the problem that, typically if Equinox was in March, then the first month after that gives us a Wednesday crucifixion, and that doesn't work. And if it didn't work that way in that year, then it had to be a different year, and so it's a problem. Well, if the equinox was actually a month later than it is now, that solves the problem. And so according to my understanding, this takes care of that problem. So I'm just leaving that with you to think about. You can check it out. You can decide whether this is a valid thing, but that's what I found. And I think it helps clarify those things. Now I'm going to switch to another subject that has been a big item of discussion in some places. Okay, this question has to do with what is the day of the wave sheaf? Because whatever day the wave sheaf was brought to the temple, whatever day of the week that was, Pentecost comes 50 days later, and it's on the same day of the week. Well, the difficulty in this whole thing, some people say that you should have that the wave sheaf, or that you should start counting the days for the wave sheaf on a Sabbath, a weekly Sabbath. And so you'd start counting always on a Sunday, and that puts Pentecost always on a Sunday. Well, then other people say, well, wave sheaf was on the day after the unleavened bread Sabbath, and that could be any day of the week. And so there's this question, and it all stems from the little phrase in this verse, Leviticus 23, verse 11, and verse 15 and 16, where it says, the morrow after the Sabbath. So Leviticus 23, 11, and verse 15 and 16. He shall wave the sheaf before the Lord to be accepted for you on the morrow after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it. And then verse 15, and you shall count unto you from the morrow after the Sabbath, from the day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offering, 7 Sabbaths shall be complete. Even unto the morrow after the 7th Sabbath shall you number 50 days, and you shall offer a new meat offering unto the Lord. So this is a discussion that comes up sometimes among feast keepers and even among the Jews. I went onto a Jewish site. Well, no, it was at Wikipedia. I went on Wikipedia to find out what they say about counting the Omer, which is counting the days between wave sheaf and Shavuot. There's 50 days, so they count every day, they count the Omer. And this is what it said in Wikipedia. Karaite Jews and Israelite Samaritans begin counting the Omer on the day after the weekly Sabbath during Passover, rather than on the second day of Passover, the 16th of Nisan. This is due to differing interpretations of Leviticus 23, 15, and 16, where the Torah says to begin counting from the morrow after the day of rest. Well, in King James, it says morrow after the Sabbath. Rabbinic Jews interpret the day of rest to be the first day of Passover, or the first Sabbath of unleavened bread, while Karaites and Samaritans understand it to be the first weekly Sabbath that falls during Passover or during the festival. Thus, the Karaite and Samaritan Shavuot is always on a Sunday. And then there was a few other things said. And then down at the end of the paragraph, it said, this is also the opinion of Catholics and the historical Sadducees and Bethusians. Okay, so there's discussion among the Jews themselves over which day you should have wave sheaf, and then that determines when Shavuot comes up. Well, I went and found a whole bunch of quotes from various sources that, to me, establish that the wave sheaf should be on the 16th of Nisan, regardless of what day of the week that is. Okay, here are some of the quotes that I found. This is from Patriarchs and Prophets. The Passover was followed by the 7 days feast of unleavened bread. The first and the seventh day were days of holy convocation when no servile work was to be performed. On the second day of the feast, the first fruits of the year's harvest were presented before God. And it goes on and talks about the grain and all that. That's Patriarchs and Prophets, page 539. And the Desire of Ages, page 77. The Passover was followed by the 7 days feast of unleavened bread. On the second day of the feast, the first fruits of the year's harvest, a sheaf of barley, was presented before the Lord. So there again, the second day of the feast. It's talking about the feast of unleavened bread. First day was a Sabbath. The second day was Nisan 16 or Abib 16. Okay, so that's from Ellen White, Spirit of Prophecy, from Patriarchs and Prophets, and the Desire of Ages. Now here's a few more. From Albert Barnes, his commentary, it's called Notes on the Bible. This feast, Pentecost, so it's referring, this is actually a comment on Acts, I forget what verse it was, but it's in Acts. This feast, Pentecost, was reckoned from the 16th day of the month Abib, or April, or the second day of the Passover. The Paschal lamb was slain on the 14th of the month at even. On the 15th day of the month was a holy convocation, the proper beginning of the feast. On the 16th day was the offering of the first fruits of harvest, and from that day they were to reckon 7 weeks, that is, 49 days, to the feast called the Feast of Pentecost, so that it occurred 50 days after the first day of the feast of the Passover. And from another commentary, Vincent's Word Studies, he's talking about the meaning of the word Pentecost, meaning 50th, because occurring on the 50th day, calculated from the second day of unleavened bread. Some more comments here. This is top one there is from John Wesley and his comment on Leviticus 23:11 and Leviticus 23:15. The morrow after the Sabbath, after the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which was a Sabbath or day of rest, as appears from Leviticus 23:7, or upon the 16th day of the month, and this was the first of those 50 days, in the close whereof was the Feast of Pentecost. And then his comment on Leviticus 23:15, from the morrow, in other words, he's commenting on the idea of the morrow after the Sabbath, from the 16th day of the month and the second day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread inclusively. So John Wesley says it was the 16th day of the month. S.N. Haskell, Stephen Haskell, in his book, The Cross and Its Shadow, page 108. The offering of the first fruits came on the third day of the Passover feast. Now he's talking about that the first day of the Passover feast would have been the Passover itself, which is the 14th. The 14th day of the month, Abib or Nisan, the Passover was eaten. The 15th day was the Sabbath, and upon the 16th day, or as the Bible states it, on the morrow after the Sabbath, the first fruits were waved before the Lord, Leviticus 23:5-11. And another commentary here, Matthew Henry, from his commentary on the Bible, his commentary on Leviticus 23:11. An order for the offering of a sheaf of the first fruits was upon the second day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The first is called the Sabbath because it was observed as a Sabbath. And on the morrow after that, they had this solemnity, the little ritual of bringing the first fruits. So those are some of the quotes, and I got a few more here. These are from Alfred Edersheim, who was a Jew and accepted the Messiah and became a Christian, and he was very well known for his commentaries on the life of Jesus, the temple. I've got some of them here. He had some excellent books that he wrote on some of these things. Okay, from his book, The Temple, Its Ministry and Service, he gives kind of a little rundown of the days there. Spring equinox, the end of March or beginning of April. Day 1 was with the new moon. And day 14, the preparation for the Passover and the Paschal sacrifice. Day 15, the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Day 16, waving of the first ripe omer. And then day 21, which is 7 days after the first day, the close of the Passover. Then from his book, The Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah, these may seem trifling distinctions, but they suffice to kindle the passions. Even greater importance attached to differences on ritual questions, although the controversy here was purely theoretical. For the Sadducees, when in office, always conformed to the prevailing Pharisaic practices. Thus, the Sadducees would have interpreted Leviticus 23:11, 15, and 16 as meaning that the wave sheaf, or rather the omer, was to be offered on the morrow after the weekly Sabbath. Here he's talking about the differences in their interpretation. That is, on the Sunday in Easter week, which would have brought the feast of Pentecost always on a Sunday, while the Pharisees understood the term Sabbath of the festive Paschal day. Connected with this were disputes about the examination of the witnesses who testified to the appearance of the new moon and whom the Pharisees accused of having been suborned by their opponents. So there was this discussion even way back when of which day to have as the first day counting toward Pentecost. Okay, that's from Edersheim. Here's from a book by a former Jew who became a Christian or Messianic Jew, maybe, Michael Strassfeld, and he wrote a book on the Jewish holidays. He says the period called the Omer begins the second night of Passover and continues until Shavuot. The Omer, which literally means a measure, was an offering of the first of the new grain harvest, which was brought to the temple on the 16th of Nisan, the second day of Passover. And then from Josephus again, who lived in the time of Jesus, or shortly thereafter. I mean, he was a historian that gave us a lot of history from that time. In his book, Antiquities of the Jews, but on the second day of unleavened bread, which is the 16th day of the month, they first partake of the fruits of the earth, for before that day they do not touch them. And then he goes on and explains how they would offer the first fruits. And I won't read the rest of that. And another one here, this is actually from Uriah Smith in a book that he titled The Day of the Crucifixion and Resurrection of Christ. Let the reader note the order of these events. The Paschal lamb was slain on the 14th day of the month. The 15th day was the Passover Sabbath, and on the 16th day, the morrow after that Sabbath, the sheaf of the first fruits was waved before the Lord. Now, and he goes into some details here that I think are important, and we maybe kind of pass over this sometimes, but he brings out some interesting things here. Now, as the Passover lamb typified the death of Christ, so the wave sheaf typified his resurrection. Paul not only calls Christ our Passover, but he calls him also our first fruits. For as in Adam all die, even so in Christ shall all be made alive. But every man in his own order, Christ the first fruits, afterward they that are Christ's at his coming. 1 Corinthians 15, 22 and 23. But now is Christ risen from the dead and become the first fruits of them that slept. Verse 20. And in fulfilling this type, Christ must follow the same order on the same dates. Thus, he was slain on the 14th day of the month, which that year fell on Friday. The next day, the 15th, was the Passover Sabbath, and chanced that year to be the weekly Sabbath also. And we know in the gospel, it talks about it being the high Sabbath. Well, they would only call it a high Sabbath if it was the weekly Sabbath, in addition to being the festival Sabbath. On the morrow after the Sabbath, the 16th, which happened that year to come on the first day of the week, he was raised from the dead in fulfillment of the type of the wave sheaf. There was but one full day, the 15th of Nisan, between the killing of the lamb on the 14th and the waving of the sheaf on the 16th. So there could have been but one full day between Christ's death upon the cross and his resurrection. Whoever puts in more shatters the whole typical system into fragments by making it a failure. But the fact that Christ was crucified the 14th and raised the 16th does not vitiate the declaration that he was to be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. For that expression includes, as we have seen, more than simply the time he was in the grave. It reaches from his betrayal to his resurrection. And between those points, there is all the time requisite to fulfill the prediction. And that whole discussion of 3 days and 3 nights and all that, that's another topic. I won't get into that, but he goes on and finishes his explanation here. With the view here presented, namely that Christ was betrayed the evening following the 13th of Nisan, was crucified Friday the 14th, and expired and was buried between 3 p.m. and sunset of that day, lay in the grave the 15th, and rose on the morning of the first day of the week, the 16th. With this view, we say there is the most perfect harmony between type and antitype, prediction and fulfillment, the words of Christ and the words of his disciples, and the testimony of all the evangelists throughout. There is not a flaw, fallacy, weakness, or discrepancy in the entire argument. And we commend it to all who may have been in any wise perplexed on this subject as one on which they may rest with all the assurance that is born of demonstration. So he's talking about the symbolism of the lamb being slain and the first fruits and all that, pointing specifically to Jesus and all that happened to him. Okay, one more thing here, one more quote, and this actually comes from a Jewish website. On the second, this is current stuff. On the second day of Passover, in the days of the temple, an omer of barley was cut down and brought into the temple as an offering. This grain offering was referred to as the omer. So there again, it's saying the second day of Passover. Matters not what day of the week that is. It's the second day of the feast. So from these quotes, which I take as being quite reliable, we can see that Jesus died on Friday. He was in the grave on Sabbath. And that week it was, or that year, it was the festival Sabbath and the weekly Sabbath on the same day. And that on the 16th of that first month, he rose as the first fruits, and 50 days later was Pentecost. And it's on the same day as the wave sheaf. So he was crucified on the 14th, he laid in the grave on the 15th, and he rose on the 16th as the first fruits. And here we have the verses that Uriah Smith quoted, 1 Corinthians 5:7, purge out therefore the old leaven, that you may be a new lump as you are unleavened, for even Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us. And as first fruits, 1 Corinthians 15:20, but now is Christ risen from the dead and become the first fruits of them that slept. Now, something about the symbolism and some of the things that come into the picture. Jesus was crucified, he laid in the grave over one day, and he rose on what the Bible calls the third day. And remember, the disciples that were walking to Emmaus said, this is the third day. Okay. Now, one of the factors that comes into this is if he had laid in the grave from Wednesday all the way through until Sunday, his body would have started putrefying. Remember when Lazarus was in the grave for 4 days, and Martha told Jesus, don't have us open that tomb because his body is going to stink by now. Well, if Jesus had laid in the grave that long, his body would have started putrefying, and that would not go along with what was prophesied. Psalm 16, verse 10, for thou wilt not leave my soul in hell or in the grave, neither wilt thou suffer thy Holy One to see corruption. And all these other verses here, Acts 2, verse 25 to 32, basically gives the same idea. It's quoting from, or it's referring back to the prophecy that he would not suffer corruption. And Acts 13, 33 to 37, same thing. That he was raised before there was any corruption of his body. So Jesus himself prophesied that he would rise the third day. In all these verses here, Matthew 20, verse 19, they shall deliver him to the Gentiles to mock and scourge and crucify him, and the third day he shall rise again. Mark 10, verse 34, they shall mock him and scourge him, and they shall spit upon him and shall kill him, and the third day he shall rise again. Luke 18, 23, they shall scourge him and put him to death, and the third day he shall rise again. And Luke 24, this is actually the Pharisees talking to Pilate and saying that Jesus said, this is Jesus talking to his disciples, And he said unto them, thus it is written, and thus it behooved Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead the third day. So he was crucified the first day, he laid in the grave the second day, he rose the third day as the wave sheaf. So, getting the symbolism in there, getting the time frame in there, and looking at the calendar and all these different things, Jesus rose on the day of wave sheaf, and it didn't matter what day of that is. Wave sheaf can be on any day of the week, which puts Shavuot or Pentecost on the same day of the week, 50 days later. Another factor that comes in here, which, for those that think that wave sheaf should always be on the day following a weekly Sabbath, when I look at that, it just looks a little too much like the Catholic concept and the evangelical Christian concept that, yes, Jesus rose on Sunday, and so we celebrate his resurrection on Sunday. And, it just looks too much like matching up to their concept. And I just think that we should avoid that as much as we can. We need to go with the days that it gives us in the Bible, and stay away from anything honoring specifically Sunday. There are times when wave sheaf comes on Sunday, Pentecost may happen on Sunday, whatever, that happens occasionally, but it's not a consistent thing. We go by Passover is the 14th, unleavened bread Sabbath is the 15th, wave sheaf is the 16th. And so, to me, that's the way it ought to be. I can tell that in this group, you're not going with the day after a weekly Sabbath, because today is Tuesday. Wave sheaf happened on a Tuesday also. So I think that's good. So anyhow, just for your information, just for some, confirming some things, I just wanted to share these things that I've discovered, and hopefully they'll be helpful to somebody else.
So I've been keeping both because I wasn't sure about that word Sabbath in there. I mean, it must be a mistake in the King James if that's the case, because it's H7676, which is always interpreted the seventh-day Sabbath throughout the whole Bible. So they had to have had the wrong word in that verse.
Well, I'm not sure about the words there, but with all of these commentaries and Ellen White saying it and everything, I'll take it as the 16th day of the month, regardless of what day of the week that is.
Yeah, and I know that there are mistakes in the King James. It's just the most accurate out there kind of a thing. And I never know where the mistakes are. So this is very helpful, because the people, first of all, Ellen White, we know she was in touch with God directly pretty much. And then all the people that lived back in the time, they understood. But the reason I think why it's such a big controversy, if you will, why there's two camps, is because with him dying on Friday and then resting on Sabbath and then raising again on Sunday, 3 days in a row, right? Both mathematical, they both end up on Sunday. So his example didn't help to clarify. It just said they're both right. And so I've
But
been
Passover isn't always on Friday, so we
right.
can't
No,
go
I
there
know
either.
I
And
know
the Bible
what he
the
said.
Bible didn't make a mistake. It was the ones that interpret it and put those numbers in.
Right.
And that's not the only numbers that are wrong. I mean, they don't have everything right in that book, the Strongs. Right. But I loved it because my dad did that too, as far as how long would he live or how long would he be without his body, going bad, all that stuff. My dad has that, and I've tried to explain this to people, and you did it so well. I will play this over and over. It proves it very, very well. Thank you.
Kimber, thank you. That was very well explained, and I agree with Melissa and Sandy. Totally, that was really good. Thank you.
Yeah, that's why it was so helpful, because I think that's why we needed you. And in fact, that was actually the question that I texted to Keith a little while ago, I didn't want to bring it up because I didn't know. I've been studying, I've been looking, I've been whatever, asking God, which one's right, which one's right. I don't know, I can't figure this out. And then boom, you come and show up with the answer.
My dad asked the
Good.
Jews, my dad asked a Jewish man, and he said, take it in context. Said it was not the seventh-day Sabbath. Take it in context, and that's what it is. It's the third day, not, the end of it. It's on the third day anytime. And it's just, if you really read it, there's no way to do that. And same with what you said about how he's going to go, how the month changed, back then. And so it couldn't be, Wednesday. I mean, that was excellent. And it's all there. People just don't want to believe it because they have their minds made up and can't do it. Judy or Bill has a question. Your hand's up.
Did have a question about that word 7676. So I looked it up in other places, like the Day of Atonement uses that, and that is not a seventh-day Sabbath. I find that word is used inconsistently.
Yes.
It's not always the seventh day. And even Leviticus 25:8 talks about the Sabbath of years or something. So that's not an exclusive argument.
But those are Sabbaths. The Day of Atonement is to be treated just like the seventh day. But
yes.
But it is not the seventh day. And they also, there's a lot to it. You just have to study it. But that to me made it, even more clear. I understood it and I always believed it, but some people are just stuck on it and won't give in. But, and the 7 Sabbaths are weeks. So it's 7 weeks.
If you, Kimber, that was excellent. And, to kind of end the controversy too is, just go to the Jewish Encyclopedia and just on there, just look up Pharisees, Jewish Encyclopedia of Pharisees, and it'll tell you all the laws that they abrogated and changed from Passover all the way through Tabernacles, and then what they did to change the Sabbath, all before Jesus came. But one of the things that they did was, it says, and this is the Jewish Encyclopedia that rabbinical Judaism today is based on, the Pharisees, and it says they changed the first fruits to always be a Sunday, so that the Passover would always land on a Sunday. They purposely wanted it they changed it from the 14th and 16th day to the Sabbath and then the Sunday following. And that was made by them, and they gave themselves the authority to do that, and then said anybody who does not do that, is out of the church, out of the synagogue, whatever. So it was very important to them, and and the source is the Jewish Encyclopedia, and that's what they recognize as a change to the original biblical law. It was changing it to always be a Sunday, so that Pentecost always landed on a Sunday. Or, of course, they call it the Feast of Weeks or Feast of Ingathering, would always land on a Sunday. So just adding to what Kimber said with a different source.
Okay, yeah.
Just like Easter Sunday.
Yeah, exactly why they did that.
And, I prefer to avoid anything that emphasizes Sunday.
Right. And that's what, Council of Nicaea was, to purposely make sure it was nothing like what they called the Jewish holy days, which of course were the biblical holy days. And so that's when they moved Sunday and Passover and all this sort of stuff. So they didn't know, the Catholics just followed in the same manner as the Pharisees. And they used by tradition, not by text. So yeah, but your presentation, I also really liked the first part of your presentation. I thought it was fascinating what you said about the Chinese archaeological evidence. That to me is absolutely amazing.
Yeah, and you can find that information on quite a few websites. We saw a video of a of an Adventist missionary who had been in China, and he was the first one that we found that talked about that, how that their ancient writings and even their language
Yes.
shares things that they understood Christianity way back in those early days, and now it's totally unchristian. But there's a
Yeah.
lot of fascinating things about the Chinese history that you don't hear much.
Even their alphabet. I mean, I've seen things on that where showing that, like evil was, a snake, and I mean, everything that was so, and that I was always amazed by. But to find actual archaeological evidence of text like you just read in that time period that you just read, 31 AD and all this, that is to me just such an incredible proof. I love that. That was great, Kimber.
Hello, hello. Can I say something?
Yeah.
Yes, hi. First of all, Hak Samek, Shavuot Samek, Hashem Yeshua. This is your Jewish Adventist fan, Mark here in Baltimore, Maryland. An excellent presentation. I actually have a question I want to ask you. In the, and I'm using a little bit of Hebrew out, so I will translate. In the Bris Hadashah, the New Testament, Yeshua talks about the fact that he will be in the grave for 3 days and 3 nights. Now, if you take literally that each day, if you take it literally, days and nights would be like 24 hours for each day. That's a day and night portion, and multiply times 3. You get up to 372 hours. And I know you said that someone in the presentation, if he had stayed in the grave for 3 days, his body would have become putrefied or something like that. But then how do you explain 3 days and 3 nights? Because I tend to take it literally, believing that he went into the tomb on Wednesday, 3 o'clock, and then he was resurrected on Shabbat afternoon of that year around 3 o'clock. That finished up the 72-hour count. So how do you explain his statement, 3 days and 3 nights? You'd be saying that it must like,
Mark,
which I was surprised to hear say.
The Bible doesn't say Jesus was in the grave 3 days and 3 nights.
Well, what it actually says is he would be in 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. That's the
Which
actual.
was in
That's
jail.
what I mean. Well, so how do you explain that?
That wasn't when he was dead. That
A
was
day
when he was
back, a day
arrested.
back then is not a 24-hour period. If you have 3 or 4 hours, they call it a day. Just like if you're going from one town to another, it says it's a day's journey. Well, that wasn't a 24-hour day. That was a traveling day.
Well, let me explain something. My son Sean actually wrote an article on that, and to me it seemed to explain it quite well.
He was in the jail. He was arrested.
Well, Jesus says he would be in the heart of the earth. Well, to the Jews, heart means the middle, the center, the most significant part of whatever it was.
Amen.
And so he was saying, Jesus was saying, I will be in the most significant part of the earth, and he's talking to his disciples. To the Jews, that probably meant the heart of the earth was Jerusalem. That was the center of the earth to them. That was the center of everything. That was the most important place in the whole world to them. And so to be in the heart of the earth could very well to them mean he would be in Jerusalem. Well, he entered Jerusalem on Wednesday after the triumphal entry, and he was in Jerusalem from then until Sabbath evening or whatever. It doesn't say he was in the grave for 3 days and 3 nights. It says he was in the heart of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights. So
Amen.
He entered Jerusalem and he went into his experience in the Garden of Gethsemane and his trial and all that kind of stuff. That did take 3 days and 3 nights. And so, that's understanding.
You also have to remember it said that he will raise on the 3rd day. So if he was raised on the 3rd day, he couldn't have been there 3 days and 3 nights.
Those verses that I had there, it said that he would rise on the 3rd day, and those disciples going to Emmaus said, "This is the 3rd day." So first day was the day he was resurrected. And Ellen White describes it.
Thank you for clarifying it.
Ellen White describes it as when the women were coming to the grave on that Sunday morning to put the spices in with his body, when they got there, and I don't know if she says that they actually saw the angel come down, but she says the angel came down and it was like a flash of lightning, which stunned the soldiers that were there, and they fell as dead men. And the angel rolled away the stone, called Jesus out of the grave and all that. This was early Sunday morning. That was the description that she gave of his resurrection, that this was very, very early Sunday morning. And when the women came to the grave, he was already out of the grave, and they saw that the stone was rolled away and the angel was sitting on the stone.